Good morning. On behalf of Dr. Gouge and the Board of Trustees of Auburn University, I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning and also those joining us online. Today, we are extremely happy and proud to have the Director of the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs, with us today. He is the inaugural director of that organization, and it is truly an honor for the McCrary Institute, which is hosted here at Auburn University. And I noted that we are joined by one of our deans here today with Chris Roberts joining us. Chris, thank you for allowing us to use your newest facility. It is truly a testament to what your school and department has done. Thank you very much. We very much appreciate it. Also, I couldn't think of a better way for us to kind of kick off the speaking this year for the McCrary Institute with us hosting it here and with the speaker that we have today. Now, my colleague and the McCrary Institute director, Frank Saluffa, will share with you shortly some of the details of Chris's professional background. What I should underscore, however, is the alignment of our two missions that we have, that of CISA and that of the McCrary Institute. Now, as the name suggests, we both seek to advance the national security interest of the United States by developing and working to implement solutions to the toughest cybersecurity and infrastructure security challenges that the country faces. What I would tell you, I had breakfast this morning with Chris, and we had the opportunity to talk just a little bit. The challenges remain the same. They're moving at a faster pace. But I can also say, after stepping out of that world, that it was refreshing to hear the progress that has been made and the hard work that is being done by his agency and by the department. He will be sharing his thoughts on how CISA plans to go about that task in the weeks and months ahead. For our part, here on campus, we have designed and executed a multidimensional approach that draws upon and leverages our assets, including our profound base of knowledge and, more importantly, our innovation that our students bring. We believe that Auburn University is a deep repository of great technical expertise. Notably, that's in the College of Engineering, including our Cyber Research Center. Our education efforts run both wide and deep, including our newest program that has just been announced, a graduate certificate in cybersecurity management that is offered by the Harvard College of Business. We also have many robust partnerships with industry, including those anchored primarily at our Huntsville Research Center, and I note that Rodney is here today. Rodney, good to see you again. And in Washington, D.C., our Center for Cyber and Homeland Security focuses on policy and helps shape the national conversation on critical issues related to cyber and infrastructure security. I want to underscore that last part. The policy piece on this is hard. It crosses a lot of different tribes, as we say in Washington, D.C. And I know from having sat in on those discussions that those conversations that Chris gets involved in at the policy level, as we look at the intersection of public and private, and we start discussing things like your civil liberties, those are tough discussions. So Chris, on behalf of us that have served, I want to thank you for what you continue to do for this nation every day. It's truly a testament to you and your people. So it's our privilege to have him here today. We stand ready to support your mission that you have at CISA in whatever way that we can. I want to thank everyone again for being here today. And Frank, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, General. I think you captured that as well as anyone can in such a short order of time. So, I mean, anyone who doesn't know, General Burgess is a true national treasure and one of the primary reasons a lot of us come to campus. So thank you for your leadership here. and obviously Dean Roberts as well. So this is the first day, first big event in this great new building, so thank you. I'll be very brief, which one of my patented lines is, anyone who knows me will tell you I've never had an unspoken thought, but I think that General Burgess captured everything very well here. I want to make sure we save most of our time to hear from our special guest, and I think General Burgess put it well. I mean, Chris has brought a real steady hand to one of the most important agencies in the federal government. And when you look at the mission and the responsibilities and the roles that not only the Department of Homeland Security, but in particular the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has, it can be mind-numbing. It can actually be overwhelming. And I'm thrilled that Director Krebs has chosen Auburn University to be the place that he unveils and rolls out his strategic intent. In the military, you call it commander's intent. Here we have the director's intent in terms of what his intentions are for CISA today, and just as importantly, going forward. So I've had the privilege, for complete transparency, of working with Chris for well over a decade. I always leaned on him, and he was always on my speed dial when I had tough questions well before he went to the Department of Homeland Security. He's done yeoman's work at Microsoft, and I think he's been the ideal first director that CISA could have asked for once it morphed from the NPPD, which I don't even remember what NPPD stands for, which was the legacy agency at DHS. So without further ado, we've got someone who's got one of the busiest schedules in Washington. It's a wonderful privilege for him to be able to take time out of that schedule to speak to all of you. When I look at Auburn University, we've got some of these rock star students. I want to make sure some of the students are involved in the dialogue as we go forward, because ultimately we are arming that next generation workforce, the cyber warrior of today, the cyber warrior of tomorrow, and just as importantly, the cyber defenders of today and tomorrow. Hopefully all of the best will be working for CISA going forward. So without further ado, Chris, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours, and he will speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll be involved in a Q&A. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning. I'm not sure I deserved all of that introduction, but I'll take it, and then I'll channel that energy back into my remarks this morning. I don't use podiums for a couple reasons. One, I have terrible posture, and I'll just lean on it. And the other is I tend to drink too much coffee in the morning to help me get through the day, so I have a tendency to pace around. So bear with me. Hopefully that'll keep you awake too. But to start, this was an easy decision to get down to Auburn. As Frank mentioned, I've known him for quite some time. And just like he calls me, I call him when I have thorny issues that I need to work through and I want a sounding board, somebody that really has been a trusted advisor to me for many years. So thank you for having me down here. Now, it was an easy decision, but as Frank mentioned, it was not quite as easy logistically to get down here. Not getting to Auburn necessarily, but escaping the gravity well of DC and hitting places not known as California, or New York City. Those are the things that I've got to continue to reach out. So for me, it's a real treat to get down to places like Auburn, the emerging centers of excellence and the real centers of gravity, the state of Alabama, in terms of cybersecurity, robotics, AI, machine learning, really high technology. This is where that next generation of innovation for America is happening. And I'm fortunate in that I've got a kind of an alternate site, or what we call CISA South, down in Pensacola. And so as I'm looking at what's happening in Florida and Alabama and Georgia, I'm looking at Pensacola, and then I'm drawing a line due north up to Huntsville. And what intersects that line? Right there in the middle, or at least towards the south, is Auburn. So we're really working on how we take advantage of the prioritization of cybersecurity and advanced technology that the state has made, and how can we ride on that and benefit from the exhaust. But additionally, why was it easy for me to get down here? Well, I had deep roots in Alabama. My mom was born in Phoenix City. not too far from here. She grew up in Florence. So I spent many of my summers up on the Tennessee River and spending time with my grandparents. And then my father was born in Birmingham, and he grew up in Birmingham. My parents met in Birmingham. They got married. They moved to Atlanta. Now, this is the point where we talk about the other school in the state. My mom's side of the family is all the other side, the other school. My dad's side of the family, if you're expecting me to say Auburn, unfortunately, only one of my dad's 5 brothers went to Auburn. The rest went to the other school that has these colors, UVA. That's where I went. I'm just going to leave that there. Yeah, you said it, not me. So, but I also, at the same time, spent growing up in a football family, a lot of time at Jordan-Hare, a lot of time in Atlanta at Georgia Tech games. So the ethos of SEC football and ideally going forward as ACC football and just traveling around the South, getting to see these college towns, getting to see that this is where the community really centers and builds out of. It was easy to get down here. And at the same time, I also grew up going to the beach down in Perdido Key and Orange Beach. So again, I know this area pretty well, and it's a real pleasure to get back. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the strategic intent of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, and where it comes from, what the mentality of the organization, what my priorities are to drive the workforce going forward. Now, it's a funny thing because we became an operational agency on the level of the Transportation Security Administration and FEMA and things like that last November. And yet I've been at the helm of the organization since August of 2017. So we're looking at about 2 years now. I have been restructuring in part the organization, but also really refining down what our priorities are. And so when I've been doing public speaking and strategy sessions and policy sessions and testifying on the Hill and talking to the congressional overlords and working on issues with the White House and the National Security Council, it's really been a function of distilling down the things that are most important. And that was really, really crystallized first with the passage of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act, which I'm going to pause for a minute and recognize Jeremy Mishler, who used to be on my team, but he's a traitor and went to the private sector. But that's okay. But he was really instrumental in leading my legislative affairs team and getting that across the finish line. But a funny little thing happened on the way to implementation. So that was passed in November of 2018. The president subsequently signed it into law on November 16th, and then this thing called the shutdown happened. So it really ground operations from an agency just as we're getting lift off the runway. And we've got a great implementation plan into 2019. We have to slow things down. And so in that 35-day period, as a team, we sat together and said, okay, when we get back up and running, what are the things we're going to focus on? What are the things that are going to be our operational priorities over the next 5 years? And why is that important? Because when half of your workforce is sitting at home for 35 days, you can't bring them in to the machine and spin back up to 100% operational capability right off the bat. You got to phase into, you got to spin back up in a measured way. So it was really important, we thought as a leadership team, to identify those things that were the most important. And I set out a set of operational goals or priorities. I'll talk about those in a minute. But at the really top, I think before we even talk about these things, you have to understand what CISA is as an organization. So the best way to think of us is we are the nation's risk advisor. And I use these words carefully. I say advisor, not manager, because when you think about critical infrastructure, when you think about cybersecurity in the United States, I'm not sitting on top of networks pushing buttons. That's the owner-operator of the system, whether it's a state government system, whether it's an election official managing their network, whether it's Alabama Power, whether it's Auburn University. They own the risk. My job is to provide them information, insight, coordinating mechanisms, and capacity building tools or capabilities to get better, to get good, to manage their risk. So we sit on top inner enablers. We're facilitators of better cybersecurity. And that's really what the strategic intent unpacks. How are we going to do this in a way? And so we set out a mission, a vision, and a set of principles for how we're going to execute this. So the mission at the very top is consistent with this risk manager understanding, or this risk manager motto. And at its very core, our mission is to be the nation's leader, the nation's risk manager in critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, and physical security. That's it. It's pretty simple. The vision itself, what is the desired end state that we want to achieve? Well, that's also pretty straightforward. While I am not a man of few words up on a stage, when it comes to paper, I like concise, crisp, as few words as possible. So for us, it's simple. A secure and resilient infrastructure for the American people. That's where we want to go. That's what we're working to achieve. That's what we're working to enable. But to do that, we've got to be very focused on how we're doing it. So that's where the 5 principles come in. The 5 principles at the top line. First, we're going to lead the national effort to protect and ensure a resilient infrastructure in a collaborative way. My organization is only about 2,200 federal employees split across physical, cybersecurity, and emergency communications. Compare that to the Department of Defense, the size of the DoD, the size of the FBI. So we are, in certain respects, kind of like the old BASF commercials. We don't make the products you use, we make them better. That's our mentality. How do we, second principle, provide a results-driven approach? Really focus on what our stakeholders need and then design our solutions to deliver value. We can't just sit back in a good idea factory, think up things to do, and then roll out a 98% solution and offer it out and say, hey, is this what you want? Nope. We got to come at it from a different approach. What do our partners, our stakeholders actually need, and then architect solutions around that. And then the third piece, the third principle, is we have to be risk-based. We can't do everything. We can't do everything. And to pause for a second, why is this all important? Well, we look out at the risk landscape, and I'm not one to sit here and talk about there's going to be X billion devices connected to the internet by 2020. All those numbers, they're hard to comprehend, but you really have to think about the actors, the bad guys out there. From a cybersecurity perspective, we always talk about the big 4, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They all have different objectives. They're trying to achieve different things. As I've been more closely focusing on Russia and China, when we think about Russia, they're trying to disrupt the system. China, trying to manipulate the system. So that requires us to take different approaches. And at the same time, we've got this 5th actor set that we're really seeing playing out. Criminal groups, domestic terrorism. These are the things that the American people see on a daily basis. The American people don't necessarily see those threat actor nation states. That's in the intelligence. My guys can see that. But the American people see the state of Texas getting locked up. They see the 7 parishes in Louisiana getting locked up. So we've got to be able to focus both on that really exquisite threat and design solutions and engage to manage risk, but at the same time making sure that we're working the broader, more general, more publicly visible threat as well. To do that, though, is the 4th principle. Whatever we do has to be consistent with American values. General Burgess mentioned the civil liberties, privacy. It's about respecting the Constitution, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, protecting American values. So we don't go out there and push out censors from a cybersecurity perspective and just hoover up information. That's not consistent with American values. We work together with partners to help them better protect their networks, give them concepts, roadmaps, strategic frameworks on how they can manage themselves. And if they need capabilities, we'll work on that together and we'll figure out how to implement in a way that respects those foundational civil liberties and civil rights. And fifth and final in the principles, we have to do it as one agency. So Frank alluded to NPPD. So that's the National Protection and Programs Directorate. That was the prior instantiation of the cyber agency. It was a component within the Department of Homeland Security that kind of hung off the Secretary's office and was, in some respects, it was an island of misfit toys. It had disparate parts, disparate management, lots of redundancy in terms of the infrastructures. What I've been doing a lot of time over the last 2 years is figuring out how to better integrate, best integrate, align resources, reduce redundancy, and then, which is in some respects contrary to maybe what happens usually in government, I've been giving up things. I've been giving up budget. I've been giving up people. Shifting organizations or subcomponents out of the agency that don't align with the core mission, with the core ethos of the agency. And that's taken time. Things happen when they happen in DC. They take a long time to happen, and it's taken quite some time for us to get that done. So with this mission, with this vision, understanding the risk landscape, with these principles in mind, now we shift into what are we trying to accomplish here? What are the goals? What are the ways we're going to execute the goals, and what are the means by which we're going to do it? Again, I like simple, small numbers, typically small odd numbers, which means I tend to have lists of threes. But for this one, for what our mission, for what our goals are for the agency, we identified 2 core goals. And this is actually a motto for the agency. You know, I think about our role as the nation's risk advisor, but when I think about what our motto is, what is it we do every day? We defend today and we secure tomorrow. What does that mean? So there are active threats happening every day right now. Ransomware is all over the place. That's defending today. We're working with state and local governments to help protect themselves, to help defend their networks so they're not tomorrow's headline. The secure tomorrow piece is a little bit different. Securing tomorrow is about what's the next generation of technology look like, and have we baked in the appropriate security concepts, the appropriate safety concepts? Are we ensuring that when we roll out 5G at large scale in 5 years, that the things that are riding and that are depending on it are secure by design? That's securing tomorrow. And these are 2 sides of the coin for us. We have to do both. And we will always be doing both because we will never get it right. There's no such thing as perfect cybersecurity. The adversary on the physical side will always find new ways to innovate and advance their agenda. So we will always be defending today and securing tomorrow. But we have to be relentless in driving down risk and pushing awareness of the things that need to be done by the private sector, by the state and local community, by the federal community. That's our job. It's understanding what the risks are, bringing people together to manage these issues, and then building capacity. And that's really, when you break it down, the ways. The ways that we're going to get this done. We are going to conduct collaborative risk management or risk analysis. We're going to share information. We're going to gain better visibility. We're going to get out there and we're going to work in the local communities to manage risk. The means by which we do it, it's helping folks deploy sensors. It's the actual technical piece of deploying sensors. It's risk analysts. It's conducting exercises. It's conducting training. It's providing training to state and local governments. It's sharing information. So to unpack that a little bit more, when we think about the goals, when we think about defending today and securing tomorrow, what does that mean? So 4 objectives across defending today. First, cybersecurity. Second, physical security. Third, instant communications. And 4th is emerging risks, supply chain, and hybrid threats. Pretty general. Sub-objectives are where you really get to the meat of these objectives. Sub-objectives, generally across all 4, are consistent, though. As I mentioned in the ways and the means, it's understanding risk. It's bringing people together in task forces, in working groups, to share their understanding, to ensure that when the federal government has information, that we're pushing it out to people that can do something about it. And then third, building capacity. Building capacity is a term that I initially really disliked because it doesn't really tell you what it means. Building capacity, as I see it, is working with that local government, with that local election official, helping them understand the vulnerabilities in their systems, sitting down with them and helping develop a roadmap on how to get more secure, implementing multi-factor authentication, updating, getting on modern systems, shutting down external ports. That's what we're seeing a lot of right now. Just basic cyber hygiene is still really hard to do across America. It's increasing awareness. What does increasing awareness do? Increasing awareness leads to increased investment. What does increased investment lead to? Increased capacity. So our job, in a lot of respects, is not deploying strike teams, fast roping into sites, and locking down networks. Our job is much more community building, capacity building, bringing everybody together to understand what the risks are, what they need to do. Now, I think if you sat back and thought about it, you'd be pretty shocked that not everybody recognizes that cybersecurity risks are growing and, just basically still a major concern and will always be a major concern. So, and yet, when we go out there, there's still executives that haven't invested in their organizations, that don't understand when their CISO or CIO comes up. That's if they're even lucky enough to have a CISO. There are still baseline capabilities that we have to increase across this country. A lot of this is investment at the state and local level. So to move into the second goal of securing tomorrow, a little bit more, the first 4 objectives were broad. These are broad, but in a different orientation. Securing tomorrow, the first and foremost is securing and increasing the resilience of America's critical infrastructure. And it's not just about physical, it's not just about cybersecurity, but it's about approaching risk management holistically. It's looking at the IT, it's looking at the industrial control systems, it's looking at supply chain, it's looking at insider threat. It's a broad set of disciplines, but it's evolving the way we think about risk management. So it's not just an isolated piece where it's just the CISO's job, but these risk management functions are truly managed as business risk. The second piece, and this is a primary area of focus for us, it's working with the federal interagency to increase a defensible posture across the civilian government agencies, the federal agencies. And to drill down for a second here, DoD has got it easy. The Department of Defense owns the Department of Defense networks, the DoDIN. DISA owns DoDIN and the implementation of security policy and enforcement across the DoDIN. The 99 federal civilian agencies all manage their own risk, all own their own networks. That is not a particularly defensible posture. So our job at CISA is to help those 99 agencies defend themselves. We take tools in part out of the Department of Defense and provide them, whether it's an intrusion detection system, whether it's an intrusion prevention system, just visibility and monitoring at the perimeter. We give those tools out, and then they all come up and we're able to see what the activity is and what the risk factors are. We also help buy licenses to help them manage risk inside their networks. That's through a program called Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those agencies are responsible for managing their risk. I'm putting them in a position to manage their risk better. Again, we are the risk advisors. Now, my view of these things is that that is not a tenable position. That is not a defensible position in the long term. So we are working with the Congress. We're working with the Office of Management and Budget in D.C. to help figure out what is a better posture, what is a better solution for federal civilian network protection. And so in 5 years, I think, you may see a completely different architecture across those 99 agencies. There may be some of those agencies that just say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. Somebody else do it for me. Whether it's CISA as a shared service or a quality service management offering, whether we do it or someone else does it, it's got to change. So we're helping work through those processes. You might find that some of the larger agencies figure out they can do it. But again, we need to make sure that we are understanding what's happening across the entirety of the federal government so that we can manage risk. So if we see something hit in one department, we can look for it in other departments and agencies. The way historically it's been managed, that capability is not in place. So the third piece, and I talked earlier about incident communications, but it's about interoperable emergency communication. So after 9/11, my operation, my team, through the Office of Emergency Communications, now the Emergency Communications Division, is out there helping state and local governments, public safety agencies, ensure that when a bad day happens, that they have communications that work, that are interoperable from community to community, between the emergency management community and the law enforcement, from a county to a county, from a city to a city, from a city to the state, down to the county. That sounds pretty basic, but interoperable communications is still pretty hard. 9/11 put us on a path to get there, and we are continuing to move down that path. But my team helps state and local officials develop, deploy, and maintain those systems. Last piece within the Secure Tomorrow concept is about long-term risk management. So we talked about supply chain and emerging threat in the Defend Today bucket, but longer-term risk management is about understanding what the risks are, what the gaps are going to be 5, 10 years down the road, and ensuring that we have the tools, the capabilities, and the workforce to manage those risks. Workforce is important, being here at Auburn, at the engineering school. We have to figure out a better way to bring the talent across higher education, K through 12, into the cybersecurity ecosystem. We have to give them opportunities that it's not just in DoD, it's not just in the intelligence community, it's not just in law enforcement, but it's broader critical infrastructure. We have to ensure that there is a talent base that's security first, that comes into the high-tech community. So when you develop something, whether it's an IoT device or an industrial control system, that it's not about getting first to market, that it's not about just making sure the thing works, it's about thinking through how these things can be exploited and ensuring that they're secure by design and secure by deployment. So I'm looking forward to taking the gains from this trip, from this visit, and rolling them back into my strategy efforts up in D.C. to ensure that I know how to partner with Auburn, I know how to tap into the resources that are being developed here, the talent of tomorrow, and that when I come back into the agency 15 years from now, there's a lot of blue and orange around, whether it's UVA or Auburn, or I guess what's the story? Clemson got the third pass through the uniforms. That's why the blue faded to purple by the time it got to Clemson, South Carolina. But that's the vision. That's where we're going. That's how we see the world. But I really want to hammer one last point before Frank comes up and we have a conversation. I talked at the top end about leadership through collaboration. And that really speaks to the authorities that lie within my agency. I don't have mandatory or compulsory or regulatory authorities, generally speaking, to make anyone do things. Whatever we do has to be done together. And in cybersecurity, that is the only way we're going to get it done. It has to be a collective defense approach. It has to be industry saying, you know what, I've got a problem. Government, can you help me? If not, great. And that's part of, there's a line that that was included in the strategic intent that I pulled out of my high school football days, but it's lead, follow, or get out of the way. That's really how we all have to approach this. If you have an opportunity to lead, step forward. Take some ownership of the problem, bring everybody along. If you don't have that capability, but you have something to add to the fight, get in there, follow what's being done, but be a part of it. But that's not going to always be the case. There are some opportunities where you just got to get out of the way, let the people doing the job do the job, and then everybody reaps the benefits. So to bring it back all to the top, it's going to take the federal government, state and local government, industry, and the academic community all working together, sharing our respective resources and capabilities at all levels, at the entry level and at the advanced level, if we're going to make progress here. And the best news about it, things are better than they were from a partnership perspective than they were several years ago. That awareness that I mentioned is only increasing. The investment is only increasing, and the capabilities are always increasing. Downside of that is the bad guys are getting better. So we've got to take the advantage of working together. I truly believe the defense has an advantage if we all work together. But if we stay to silos, if we stay in our corners, if we don't report or share information on the latest ransomware strain, or we don't share that we think we got bad guys in our networks, then we're never going to get better. It takes that one bit of information to unveil the whole operation. So with that, thank you for your time this morning. I think we're going to do a little conversation here.
Awesome. Please join me in thanking Chris. I mean, for tour de force in terms of what the department and what in particular CISA is looking at from a breadth and depth standpoint, I think is it's quite stunning. And I want to start with a question that you brought up, Louisiana and some of the ransomware attacks. Texas obviously got hit pretty hard last week, or very hard. Atlanta had some of its issues. There's an island here, but we're surrounded. And the reality is I think ransomware is hitting almost epidemic proportions. So looking at what you laid out as your strategic intent and not ignoring or neglecting, obviously, the high-end threat actors, the advanced persistent threats of the Russias, Chinas, North Koreas, Irans. You know, that's my background, so I'll never ignore those. But what do you see, given your new intent, how CISA can support state, local, tribal, and territorial entities in the event of a ransomware attack? And then more broadly, how you envision CISA being able to support state and local?
So first off, the opening 30 minutes or so was the dry stuff. That was here's a strategic plan, I'm going to walk you through it. I get it that that's not the high-speed, entertaining, fun stuff. This is the fun part. We did this out at the RSA conference in San Francisco back in February. So this is where we get to cut loose a little bit. So, I mentioned that there are two sides to the spectrum here. There is that intelligence-driven part that we know what Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, what their objectives are, the things they're trying to do, targeting U.S. critical infrastructure from a cyber perspective, but in some cases possibly resulting in a physical manifestation. So Director Coates talked about it in the worldwide threat assessment that the Chinese could have capabilities targeting pipelines. So we have to continue to be relentless in engaging the pipeline communities, the oil and natural gas. It's not just about the grid. You got to think about what's left of the grid. What makes the grid? What makes power generation work? Well, it's pipelines and natural gas. All right, so we've got to think about things as a system of systems from a strategic perspective. But tactically, again, that's the stuff that's happening in the SCIFs and in the planning rooms and then out in the field. But the average American sees ransomware. They're seeing their inability to not pay their water bills, like in Baltimore, for 6 months. And then 6 months later, that water bill shows up, and you think the city's just going to say, you don't have to pay for those? No. I mean, there are real economic impacts to the average American. And so we've got to figure out, if I've got 100 units of effort, how do I allocate them smartly to address that high-level risk, as well as that more pernicious yet entry-level risk? So the tools I use are going to be different. So if I'm thinking about things at the higher order of risk, I'm going to be doing much more advanced research, personnel intensive, developing mechanisms to share information. But down at the bottom, it's much more foundational and fundamental, and it's about training, it's about engagement, it's about exercise, it's about developing plans and doctrine and exercises. So we think about the physical world. We think about responding to hurricanes. There is decades of doctrine associated with how a state works with the federal government. On the cybersecurity side, there's not a lot of doctrine, and there's even less experience in terms of how the state, when they have a statewide bad day or bad weekend or bad month, what are the resources that they're responsible for? What are the resources that the federal government's responsible for? How do they all work together? And then once you break the glass, where does the additional funding come from? Again, on the hurricane and natural disaster side, it's pretty easy. There's the Stafford Act, there's the Disaster Relief Fund.
Do we need a Cyber Stafford Act?
I think we really need to look, so let's back up to ransomware. Ransomware is not going anywhere. It's only getting worse. If you look at the trend lines, the actors are shifting their business models, and they're going to more coordinated attacks like we saw in Texas, bigger payouts. What are they doing? If those things get paid out, that money's getting plowed back into the business model. The capabilities are increasing, and it just validates the business model. So, sidebar.
Pay or not pay? I got to put you on the spot here. Pay ransom or not? This is a hot debate.
Philosophically, right?
You know where I come
So first
down on
off,
this. Never.
Do you trust a criminal? Yeah. Do you trust a criminal though? Okay, here's your $400,000. Fine. Unlock my networks, and I trust that you are going to give that network back to me entirely. What we've seen is, in some cases, there's payouts, and yet the decryption isn't complete. So what'd you pay for? So that's the first part of it. The second part of it.
You don't necessarily know who you're paying, right?
That's
Foreign terrorist organization, criminal enterprises.
It is
proxies
rife with
of
peril.
State actors.
So that's point one. It's do you really think you're going to get it back? Now, sure, there's arguments that of course it's in the interest of the actor to decrypt so that other people will decrypt. But that plays into the second piece. If you do payout, you're just incentivizing the ransomware actor to keep doing this. You're validating the business model again. So the FBI is getting much more blunt on this as well, but it is not in the interest of your next door neighbor or the next company or the next county over for you to pay off, because all you've done is empowered and emboldened the bad guys to go after them next.
And do you envision a way, and I don't want to say a geek squad, where CISA can help support state and local, both in the investigatory side, and quite honestly, the Stafford Act works because federal funds do help enable some of their activity. It's not a. It's not a.
So right now, I think the answer is no. Like today, no. Why? So Texas. 22, 23 some odd jurisdictions. The Texas Department of Information Resources use Texas National Guard resources. They use Department of Emergency Management, which is part, I guess, of the Texas A&M University system now. They deployed, particularly using National Guard assets, I think close to 100 folks, and that seemed to go pretty well. FBI forensic support to help the investigation. If I had deployed it 100 people down, it would have been Keystone cops. Particularly in a realm where there's lack of national doctrine, it would have been people bumping into each other. You don't want that. So I think where we want to put a lot of effort is one, helping create that doctrine. What are best practices for statewide coordinated response? Louisiana has what's known as Emergency Support Function 17, which is cybersecurity statewide coordination. I think that's a best practice.
That is a best
so
practice.
go look at that. Go look at what Texas is doing. Work with the National Governors Association in partnership with FEMA and figure out what doctrine looks like. But then also, looking at the best practices of deploying the National Guard and saying, okay, the National Guard's got something here. But if you've seen one National Guard, you've seen one National Guard. So how do we have consistency? Can we help the National Guard Bureau develop a training regime that has consistency across working with Cyber Command, working to a consistent standard, but importantly also working with me to share information, share findings of their investigation so that we can understand what's happening, develop mitigations, develop recommendations, and then get out ahead of the next threat. So if we can divine anything from Texas, what are the things that we could push out to other counties or states to say, hey, you could do certain things so you're not next.
But you are saying that you envision 5 years from now, CISA having more of a field presence, closer to.
So we do have a field presence now. So we're not all, of the 2,200 odd folks, the federal employees I have, we've got, 400 plus out in the field.
Good number.
But I need more.
Yep.
For sure. I've got 120 physical security advisors, which do more than just, guards, gates, and guns, but only 24 or so cybersecurity advisors. So I think that there's an advantage of having every cybersecurity, a cybersecurity advisor in every state capital in all the major jurisdictions with the ability to engage, advise, assist, but not necessarily get hands on keyboard and help rebuild and recover networks. Again, I think that is, it's not FEMA's job to physically go shovel sandbags. That's up to the state and to contract that work.
I support that as 100% and recently advocated as much. I want to get to, you'd sort of mentioned priorities, you mentioned systemic risk, but you also mentioned if you have 100 units, 3 years ago, neither of us would have thought election and election security would have been at the top of that priority list. Can you give us sort of a rundown on where we are now, what you are doing to sort of enable the next sets of elections, and then how do we maintain flexibility, because 2 years from now it's going to be something else, and none of us are thinking of that's going to be at that top of the list.
So a couple things. I mentioned in the opening that coming out of the shutdown, I had 5 operational priorities. At the top, that's federal networks, which I've adapted to be just government networks. So I talked about the 2 priorities for protecting federal, the objectives for protecting federal networks. But that's number one is federal networks, and then applying those lessons learned down to state and local systems as well, which then plays into the second operational priority, and that's elections, election security. The third operational priority is soft targets. So on the physical side, we work with schools, places of worship, large gatherings like Jordan Hare, like Mercedes in Atlanta, those sorts of venues help work through what the security posture is.
And Brian Harrell will be with us tomorrow.
And Brian's going to talk a lot about that tomorrow. The fourth piece, and the fourth and fifth operational priorities are more focused on what do the next 18 months look like in terms of strategy and pathfinding, and that's industrial control systems. So it's less about the business systems and the email and the servers, and it's more about the HVAC systems and the transportation systems and automation. Do we have the right strategies, capabilities in place? That is a significant growth area, much less mature than the IT side. So really making sure that we've got our plan developed, our resources and initiatives aligned there. And then lastly, and this is probably worth an entirely separate fireside chat and keynote, but what are we doing? How are we postured? And how are we going to manage risks associated with China, supply chain
Oh,
exploitation.
I'm going there. We're not
And
setting
then
the
what
off
is
that
what is
one.
5G rollout as a proxy for this broader conversation? But back to elections. So in 2017, when I came in March of 17 as a counselor to General Kelly, I did not anticipate that I would be doing really much of anything on election security. I was soon corrected or disabused of that notion. And now I spend probably 40 to 50% of my time on election security issues. It's working with secretaries of state. I've worked with Secretary Merrill on a number of issues, Secretary Lee down in Florida. It is just one of those things that really, truly keeps me up at night. And it's in part, it's at least two parts, right? Well, if you look at the intelligence community assessment, the Russians did three things in 2016. One, they attempted to hack and manipulate the election infrastructure, the actual systems that support
themselves.
election operations. The second one is the hack and leak campaign they conducted against the DNC, getting into emails and releasing sensitive information. And the third was just this broader disinformation campaign using social media and actually, protest and counter-protest, things like that. But we're the federal lead for election security. But what federal lead means that we're providing resources, support, capabilities to state and local election officials. Under Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, states are responsible for the time, place, and manner of elections. The federal government has a supporting role here. So we put a lot of effort into making sure that we understand what state secretaries and county election officials, what they need, how they can better support, secure their systems to ensure that really the most important thing is that the American people have confidence in the process and that we have confidence that the outcomes are legit.
And how confident should we be?
I'll tell you what, I've said it before, 2018 was the safest, most secure election in modern history. And why is that? Well, in 2016, everybody was kind of, from a federal perspective, everybody was kind of going at it on their own. And by 2018, and this was because there wasn't a lot of information or intelligence that was a primary area of focus for Russia or others. It kind of emerged late in the game. And so by then, when you come in and the federal government parachutes into state capitals and says, we're here to help you, that in the midst of an election season, that doesn't always go over well. So in that 2-year time period from the 16 election to 2018, we spent a significant amount of time, energy, airplane miles, flying around the country and deploying to meet with state election officials, going back to that number one principle of leading and collaborating, but the second one of being results driven. What do they need? So what we found is they just needed to know what the threats were. They needed vulnerability assessments. They needed to be able to work together and share information. And we provided exercises. So by the time 18 came around, we were working with all 50 states and about 1,400 jurisdictions. We set up an information sharing and analysis center, which had not previously existed. We pulled that together. We're able to get the first of its kind. So FEMA every year does the great shakeout earthquake exercise. And so we did a tabletop the vote, a nationwide exercise, got 44 states, a bunch of jurisdictions, the federal government, social media companies, everybody together working on these issues. So by the time 2020 rolls around, we'll have even more local jurisdictions. At this point, we've provided to states monitoring capabilities over their election networks so that they can look and see the bad traffic coming, but we're not pausing there. We're not going to stop there. We're going to continue pushing out capabilities and really, truly working to eliminate as many vulnerabilities as possible, but also help them get to newer systems that are auditable, systems that have paper backups. These are the outcomes we have to get to.
One other question on that before we transition. So have any other countries learned the lessons from Russia in the countering foreign influence in particular, not the hack into the system and try to penetrate some of the systems, but from a countering foreign influence perspective?
Oh yeah,
that's an FBI with DHS kind of.
Well, and
everyone,
and DoD and the intelligence community.
IC.
So so there are two. I always get asked the question, what's China doing? What's Russia doing? You're seeing, I think, China be pretty active right now with respect to Hong Kong. I think on the Russia side, they've been very active in Europe. You saw the press reports from the French election from a year or so ago. But we also kind of, when you look at the Balkans, you look at Ukraine, it's kind of the devil's playground for Russia. That's where they test a bunch of stuff. For a couple reasons. One is a test bed to actually see does the stuff work in a live environment, but it's also a signaling mechanism. Say, hey, look, these are the capabilities we have, and you better watch out, or we're going to bring it to your back door.
Come to a theater near you. No, that's.
Yeah.
I think.
So what I've really been focused on with the team and working with the State Department, with the Department of Defense, IC, but also through our international partners, is I know what the Russians did in 16. I know what they tried to do in 18. I need to know what they're going to try in 20. And I'm not going to just sit here in a dark room and speculate. Let's get out there. Let's work with our partners that are having elections right now and pull together some artifacts and some findings, and let's bring that back and share that with our state and local partners. So yeah, we've gained some insights from the Ukraine, from Montenegro, from North Macedonia, and bring that back. What do we see? They're using the basics, spear phishing. They're targeting election reporting websites. So that kind of insight we can turn around, package, give right back to our state partners, our local partners, and say, you need to put more resources in hardening your email infrastructure. Get to multi-factor authentication. Do phishing training. Harden your election night reporting websites. Yep. That's the stuff that is much, much, much more valuable, as I see it, than specific indicators of compromise or look out for this IP address, because even that only would work in about 25 to 30% of the stakeholders set.
By the way, there's
don't
real
have the capability.
Precedent here, post 9/11 in terms of counterterrorism intelligence and information sharing activities we would see on the battlefield,
right,
and how we can morph that. It wasn't always the TTPs in a very tactical sense, but
right,
it was in the modality and modus operandi. That actually was invaluable information that was shared with our state and local.
The analog here, I guess, is if you've got like a scent marker or VOCs of a chemical compound associated with an explosive.
You get both of those.
Like that's exquisite.
Yeah,
but,
that's the home
in the meantime, you can look for other things of travel patterns, behaviors, those sorts of things that we want to
which
bring.
have cyber equivalent. I mean, if you think about it, Ukraine is Russia's practice field. Saudi Arabia and UAE is Iran's practice field. South Korea, Japan is North Korea's practice field. Everybody's China's practice field.
Yeah, but Taiwan in particular.
I mean, it's kind of all over.
So with respect to that, I mean, when you look at Taiwan 2020 and their election that's going to happen next year, that's going to be really interesting to look at and see what happens. And so we want to be, kind of early in the decision-making process, see what we can pick up. But
let's talk China.
Okay.
Let's talk specific 5G,
Yep.
Huawei, ZTE, all these fun topics. And you've got rural communities in particular that obviously have resource constraints, and many of them are turning to, I would say, very disconcerting technologies, but it's understandable.
So what I'd say is not necessarily turning to prospectively, but they've made decisions in the past absent prior guidance.
Yes.
And so this is sorry, finish.
No, go.
Yeah, well, so this is something the FCC is engaged in. They've issued some universal fund guidance. There's a process going on there. But any way you cut it, if decisions have been made in the past, particularly on rural telecommunications where the margins are already so thin, and you talk them, you share information. I met with some of the Alabama ones in particular, but there is potentially untrustworthy kit in their system. So how do you get them to good? Do you do it now? You do flash cut on 3G to 4G, or do you wait until the 5G piece? These are policy decisions that we're working through, but any way you cut it, there's going to be resource and funding issues associated with that. So if you expect them or ask them to pull it out, what's the backstop? Yeah. And these are conversations happening in D.C. There are a couple bills that I think that are been presented on the Senate side that would say, here's a couple $2 billion that can help manage that process. But the bigger piece here is, and this goes to that Secure Tomorrow goal that we're putting a lot of effort. We've established a task force to look at what the supply chain threats are and how we pull together the right partnerships. We've also pulled a number of initiatives together where we're looking at 5G equipment, trying to do some open-ended vulnerability testing, look for vulnerabilities, but at the same time saying, okay, what do we know about 5G? What do we know about the market? Are there alternatives to get some of that American innovation back into the stack so we're not dependent upon potentially untrustworthy companies? Now, to dive down there for a second, the main challenge right now, particularly with some of the companies coming out of China, is that we know through what their intelligence law says, we know what their cybersecurity law says.
And they're required to support.
So that's the paper, right? The law says that you have to comply with an order from the government. Now, these are likely all just fictions because the Chinese Communist Party, they do what they want. They control everything. To be a private sector company that's successful in China, you've played by their rules, and their rules include sharing and participating in the directives of the government. So I have significant concerns, particularly given our understanding and our experience of Chinese malicious cyber activity. I think the indictments in December of the APT-10 Cloud Hopper team, where they exploited managed service and cloud service providers to jump into a bunch of American and global companies, steal their intellectual property. You know, we have demonstrated bad behavior by the Chinese government and their security services, and if we see, which we do, their private sector organizations, an extension of the state, why on earth would we put them in a position to control whether our communication systems are up or down?
Yep.
That's the threshold issue here.
And just to put a fine point on that, that is 5G.
That's 5G.
That is the infrastructure that everything else will be built
So
on.
the kind of the thing that I've talked about is we're still, I think, struggling to understand what the advantages. We know that it's going to be, the bandwidth advantages, the lower latency, the ability to do network slicing, run multiple things off the same infrastructure. We don't really know what that's going to necessarily manifest in. What are the automation advantages? If a Tesla autonomous vehicle, the auto drive mode, is just kind of cutting edge right now, in 7 years, they're all going to be running on this. They're all going to be running on a certain telecommunications or dependent upon a telecommunications signal. What happens when that signal goes whoop?
Yep.
We've got to have a better process in place to understand what the dependability and trustworthiness of the equipment.
Now, I want to turn it over to others, but I want to ask one more question. So, looking at the workforce needs of today and the workforce needs of tomorrow, what does that ninja or the blocker tackler, what are you looking for, and how can our first-rate and other first-rate colleges of engineering sharpen their curricula? We've got some amazing students, we've got some terrific faculty, but titrating that at all times, how do we make sure we're developing, designing, and building the cyber defender and cyber warrior tomorrow? What would you do?
So,
given where you sit right
now.
now.
So there is no silver bullet here. There's no single solution. But I'll tell you the things that I find, the traits that are in very successful, again, InfoSec is a very broad community. There are a lot of different attributes and traits, but I find effective communications, being able to isolate an issue and talk about it in plain terms, but then if you have to, dig into the technical piece.
Yep.
And with that, effective writing, really being able to describe an issue, write about it, because if you're in DC, it should not be the metric by which we compare what success looks like, by the way. Whether it's federal agencies or whatever. But again, it's effective communications, both spoken and writing, and then just ultimately critical thinking, being able to look at issues, dissect, disassemble them, and then isolate the issues.
So it really begs a much broader.
It's
multi
multidisciplinary.
and interdisciplinary by definition.
And you look at particularly a lot of the, so I'm seeing a certain trend in some of the cybersecurity companies where they're hiring journalists. And they're not to be communicators, but to be part of the cybersecurity team.
Interesting.
So it does take
and
a
not the
liberal
cyber
arts.
comms team after they get hit, but to be part of the team. Yeah.
But again, it takes all types. I mean, you are going to need hardcore network engineers. It's the same you'll need some of the more liberal arts infused. So really, more than anything, be inclusive in your programs. Bring as many people through the program as possible. Have crossovers with the liberal arts side of the school.
This is music to my.
But again, whether technical writing is a core element of the writing program. So I went to law school. I have an environmental science undergrad degree.
George Mason, great.
Went to law school, and the thing that I found most beneficial from my law school experience was, unlike most schools where you only have to do 1 year of legal writing, at George Mason you have to do legal writing every single year. And they just drill it into you. They make you write. They make you write. They make you think. They grade you. Usually it's pass-fail. This was you actually get a grade, which the 1.5 hours credit does not resemble or line up against the amount of time you put into the project. But nonetheless, that's what I got out of law school the most. It was the ability to really isolate issues quickly through case analysis, and then being able to write effectively against it.
Can I just, because I need to highlight one individual, Dr. David Umphris. Raise your hand, David. So he is leading a major effort and will be leading a major effort university-wide out of engineering, but came to conclude very quickly that it has to be inter and multidisciplinary. So I think you just gave some reaffirmation on what it is we're trying to do here. So thank you for that. I want to make sure we have time for some questions from the audience. Do we have a mic, or just speak loud? We do have a mic. Awesome. Thank you. So wait to get the mic. Please identify yourself, and we'll go from there. So I guess Lynn,
Lynn.
BC.
Lynn Mattice, I'm a senior fellow here with the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Kind of a two-part question. One is, what do you see coming out of this new alliance between Russia and China and the new threat that's going to evolve? And the second piece of that is relative to the election security piece of it, the concern factor of fake news getting into the news cycle that the news media is putting out that can affect the election outcomes.
So to the first piece, I wouldn't necessarily, Russia, China, they ultimately have different objectives in mind. So what Russia is thinking about is, they actually have a doctrine, the Gerasimov doctrine. Russia's not trying to win because they know they don't have the economic horsepower to do it. They win by everybody else losing.
Yep.
And so they're trying to undermine our confidence in our institutions, our democratic processes, our confidence on our financial system, all that stuff. They're just trying to grind us down, and so we tear ourselves apart as the American people. That's it.
And point at each other.
Yep. And then if that happens, they win. The Chinese, much different. They're looking at being an economic superpower. They need us. They need us to buy their stuff, to invest in their manufacturing capabilities, their infrastructure. So they are seeking close entanglement, but also seeking to establish kind of that client-state relationship. It will be interesting to see how they play out as geographic partners. They will, I think, this is in part, keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. Whether they'll be able to achieve much in this unholy alliance, I guess we'll see. But we're focused on, in part, and I talked about this in the ransomware side. We have to look at the threat agnostically. We have to, yes, understand what the bad guys are doing, but then we have to pivot. There are a lot of people looking at that in the IC and elsewhere. We've got to help the private sector look internally and understand what their vulnerabilities are, that any bad actor could be exploited. So to go back to the Huawei piece real quick, the Huawei Oversight Board that the United Kingdom set up about 10 years ago, they issued a report earlier this year. And it said that even after 10 years of Huawei equipment being deployed in the United Kingdom, there's not been a material improvement in the quality of their engineering, the security of their software. And one of the biggest takeaways we had was, well, it's not necessarily even that the Chinese could exploit Huawei technology. It's that anybody could, that the Russians could write on it. So it's not a backdoor, and I'll credit this to Rob Joyce out of the National Security Agency. It's a bug door. So what we are really looking at is what the potential vulnerabilities are, and then you can start factoring the threat and the likelihood piece, but getting people into that better posture. So on the election side, this speaks to just the fake news I'll use as a bigger, the deep fakes and all that other stuff is a part of a broader campaign by the Russians in particular, but I think we just saw the Chinese do this too, of just using our new and traditional media platforms against us. We have actually put a lot of effort and thought into this lately and how we can help counter it. There are ways to directly counter it. It's to disable content, or rather accounts. It's to share information with the platforms. It's to work with the media to give them indicators of things that they should be looking for. Maybe you might not want to report on something that WikiLeaks put out, or Guccifer 2.0, whatever. We are also focused on how you build, as I talked about earlier, build the critical thinking of the American people. So we pushed out a product a couple weeks ago called the War on Pineapple. Now what this really was more than anything, it was distilling down the attributes of a social media influence campaign. It has 5 elements. First, identify a divisive issue. Second is mobilize the social media accounts. Third is start amplifying the message, get the hashtag or the conversation trending. Fourth is take it real world, and that's have the real media pick up on it. And then the fifth is make it physical and have a protest, a counter protest. These are the things that we saw Russia do in 2016. And it wasn't necessarily a political issue in terms of the 2016 race, but it's social issues, issues of race, gender. That's where they're focusing. They're getting those wedge issues to divide the American people. Again, have us fight each other so they don't have to fight. And so this pineapple pizza product was actually developed by the team over lunch one day. They were trying to figure out some not social issue, but what's a lighthearted issue that people are pretty binary on. You either love it or you hate it. And I think they were talking about a few things like cilantro or salt and vinegar chips, but they ended up getting in a pretty heated argument over lunch about whether you like pineapple on your pizza or not. So what we did is we released, we have this infographic and we have this interactive video, and we herded a bunch of our partners in the election community, the National Association of Secretaries of State, some Secretaries of State, National Association of State Election Directors, got everybody kind of on one team, and then we spun up a Twitter, a lighthearted Twitter back and forth. And then people start reporting on it.
It was effective.
NBC started reporting on it. The one thing we didn't get to was that protest, counter protest. I'm holding out hope that we can still make that a real thing.
Pineapple on pizza.
I'm with you on that. But ultimately, what we were trying to do is find something that's engaging and approachable, that's not immediately off-putting and saying that can't possibly be true, and walk people through, okay, you need to think about what's being presented to you, and here's some of the traits of what bots and trolls look like and how this plays out. But ultimately, put down the phone, go outside.
That's the cyber guy saying it, and I can't agree more. But the one thing I would also, and Fred, I'm going to jump, and a very short, because I want to make sure we get to, but quantum AI, what are your concerns? How much of it is real? How much of it is perceived? And as much as you can in 30 seconds through a China lens.
So this is one of those things in the Defend Today, Secure Tomorrow buckets. We're putting a lot of effort in just defending today, and we don't have a tremendous amount of resources put against, countering AI and machine learning, those and quantum
Adversarial
risks.
AI is here, though.
It is.
Not tomorrow.
It is.
It's today.
You'll find, I think, the intelligence community and DARPA and DoD putting a lot more resources against that. What we are looking at from a machine learning and from machine learning as a proxy for a less sophisticated proxy for the AI conversation is how do I take these capabilities and I can start putting automated tools in our defensive measures across critical infrastructure and the federal network, so I can get my analysts, my really capable analysts, higher up the analytics stack, so they can look at the harder stuff. They can also train the algorithms, but it's really about this virtuous cycle of, let's take the more mundane stuff, automate it, and then have the humans do the harder stuff.
And I think that's a really important, automated information sharing and can be done anonymously. It can get through some of the trust barriers maybe between public-private, private-private.
Yeah.
And it also allows us to put the gray matter where it's needed most, and that's on the highest end. Keep pushing that. I know it's easier said than done. Admiral Rosa, you've got a question here, and please identify yourself.
Fred Rosa with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and also a senior fellow here at CCHS. In the Securing Tomorrow lane, recognizing, of course, that cyberspace is fundamentally, inherently international, what is your vision for how the U.S. should be looking to orchestrate superior law, norms, coordination, cooperation frameworks? And who are the key players today at the U.S. government interagency table who are working that challenge?
So this is, I've always thought that you're not going to attack your way out of the problem. You're not going to defend your way out of the problem. You've got to have a common set of understandings across partners. But at the same time, there are enough bad actors out there that aren't participating in the conversation, specifically talking China and Russia. State Department specifically, and Rob Strayer's shop, owns the majority of the engagement with the ITU, with the UN. We provide a significant amount of support to those efforts. I think the prior norms conversations have been useful in terms of setting the expectations of the civilized communities out there. Whether more norms are beneficial at this point, I think that's up for discussion. Let's make sure we got the norms we have adopted and adhered to, and then we think through what does accountability look like in this space. The same token, standards is an underlying piece of a norms and a framework conversation. So what we're finding is, particularly in the 5G lens and 3GPP, we're seeing the Chinese in particular, flooding the zone, so to speak, and the standards conversations and outsized influence in those conversations. So what we've got to make sure that we're doing, and there's been a renewed focus on this within the interagency, but making sure that the standards representatives from the U.S. government and our allies are all working together. And a big part of this was earlier in the summer, the Czech government pulled together a conversation on 5G and next generation telecommunications and developed a set of Prague proposals. And one of those elements is ensuring that we're all contributing meaningfully to the standards process, developing risk-based frameworks for developing and deploying next generation telecommunications networks. So there are a number of spins that are happening, all flowing from that norms conversation of years ago.
We have time for a couple more questions, so please identify yourself, and then we'll go back there to a student.
My name is Aaron Williams. I work with critical infrastructure protection at Southern Company.
Hey.
And I had a question. We partner with several different agencies. I guess we have regulatory compliance with FERC and NERC, and then we team up with like the DOE for Coyote and CRISP, and DARPA with the Radix incident response exercises. In the next 5 to 10 years, where do you see or where do you want CISA to be in terms of partnering with private industry?
So, yeah, this is a fantastic conversation, and it's probably more of a, there are two angles to this conversation. One is what the conversation looks like in DC and what the conversation looks like out in the field. In DC, we are looking at the world as a series of, so we have historically 16 critical infrastructure sectors: energy, banking and finance, agriculture, emergency services, telecommunications, IT. The Department of Homeland Security has the lead role for 10 of those sectors. Energy obviously has the energy sector. But really, when you back up, what is most important is it doesn't matter what sector it is. If there's a piece of information that it can be pulled into some sort of over-the-top risk engine or risk architecture and data architecture that can then conduct meaningful analysis on something that may be happening in the grid and be able to share that with the critical manufacturing. If it's an industrial control systems issue, that we can take that, whether it's a Siemens, Schneider's, Yokogawa, whatever, take that piece, and then where else might we find it? It could be in critical manufacturing or department or the transportation sector. So that is really our role, is integrating across the sectors, that cross-sector risk analytics. Energy has exquisite capabilities and relationships within their sector. But what we've seen more than anything, particularly the Chinese, but also, or the Russians, but particularly the Chinese, is attacks don't happen by knocking on the door of Southern Company. Do they try that? Yeah. But 2 years ago, we saw what we called the Alien Viper campaign, but we saw the Chinese or the Russians target energy sector assets. How'd they get there? Through the construction companies, through the HVAC servicing organizations. So it's all about value chain, supply chain, and working across partners. So what we want to do is make sure that when Department of Energy through CRISP or Coyote or the future instantiations of their products, whatever their risk analysts or their analytic capabilities, that is playing into a bigger data architecture. Your boss calls it a data lake. Tom Fanning calls it a data lake. What we see it as a bigger data architecture that can ingest from energy, from treasury, from comms, from manufacturing, and that you can do that, again, that applied research across the top and get it out there to the people that need it. That's part of it. The second piece, though, is I can have the best technical tools on the back end, but if I don't have, as we were talking about earlier, a field force, a sales team to go out there and do the real boots on the ground work, then none of that stuff that sits in DC or down in Pensacola matters. None of it matters. I've got to get out there and do the physical person-to-person connections, and Brian Harrell will talk a lot about that tomorrow.
I want to get two more questions in. We have one here and then one back there, so please.
Hi, my name is Eli. I'm a student here. I was wondering, with 2,200 people and such a broad set of problems you have to solve, how are you choosing to allocate your resources, and how do you get support for some issues that maybe the public doesn't see as much but are still pretty critical?
Yeah. I mean,
Great question.
when do you graduate? This is it. This is the ballgame. This is the hardest part. 16 sectors. I've got the really exquisite nation-state stuff down here. I've got the criminal stuff, the ransomware stuff. So that's that 100 units of effort that I've got to allocate. So what we're working towards is a system that at the higher end risk level, I put probably more people against the problem than down at the bottom. So small and medium-sized businesses represent 40% of the nation's GDP. I am not going to be able to get out there and reach and touch every single one of them, or the 8,800 election jurisdictions. Yep. So what I've got to do is develop scalable tools and capabilities, but also work with partners. So when we talk about small and medium-sized businesses, there are advantages and levers I can pull within the federal government. Yep. Small Business Administration has small business development centers in almost every single community. Same goes with the Department of Agriculture and the ag extensions. There are federal government resources out there that I have to pull up into that, again, We will provide leadership for critical infrastructure protection through collaboration. So I've got to identify the levers I can pull, the scalable capabilities that already are inherent in the U.S. government. I'll tell you one thing, everybody wants to do cyber right now. Everybody. We have to do it together. I'm not owning anything. I'm enabling them. Again, we're the BASF of the federal government. We're not doing it, we're making you do it better. We're helping you do it better. That's part of the...
go back? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Look, details.
Please. Hold on one sec.
I realize I'm interrupting here.
No.
But you just hit on something that we're trying to grapple with as a university, and I know all the land-grant universities are. In the original mission of the extension systems on campus, they had particular focus. With this being so pervasive, universities, especially land-grant universities like ours, that have that opportunity in terms of outreach and extension, we can play a role in that.
Yeah.
In terms of and helping to reach out to parts of the community that you necessarily can't.
But what it really speaks to, I think, more than anything, is that every element of the economy right now has a cybersecurity element to it. So it is that multidisciplinary focus. It's baking security into it, whether it's working with the Small Business Administration or agriculture. And then another thing is the private sector has as much of a role in this as anybody. I talked about, they own the network.
Arguably more of a role.
Yeah, well, of course. And so it's working with the U.S. Chamber and the local chambers of commerce. It's finding champions. Because increasingly, I think what we see is I was talking about awareness and investment and capability. I think about these things, I see frameworks everywhere, but this is more of an XY axis. We were talking about this last night, but if you plot it out, there's the x-axis, the independent variable is awareness. Mark it out to 10. The y-axis is the dependent variable, and that's either some mix of investment or capability. So you don't get investment unless you understand the threat, and then that informs how you invest. And that generally maps against capability. Not lockstep, not always, but generally maps against capabilities. So what we're finding is if you plot out at the far top, you're finding really sophisticated organizations that invested hundreds of millions of dollars. Think about the big banks. They're the haves.
And they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on cybersecurity, just so people have a sense of awareness.
And then closer to 0-0 is the
Small
under-resourced, whether it's a mom and pop organization,
even small,
or
medium
small
banks.
jurisdictions, small banks, right? And those increasingly are starting to look like the have-nots. So how do we cascade or waterfall down capabilities from the haves into the have-nots? Really trying to push a lot of programs. So this was one of the best things that came out of the DEF CON cybersecurity conference a couple weeks ago in Vegas. There was an initiative launched called Unhack the Ballot. And really what that means is taking security researchers where they sit. Because they're not all in DC, they're not all in Silicon Valley. Just like we're seeing here in Auburn, there's security research and cybersecurity capabilities everywhere across this country. So if you care about the process, if you care about the democratic process, get involved, not just by voting, but help out, volunteer, understand the challenges of an election official, help them get better. And so partly on the private sector side, what we want is this give back concept of the big banks, the big energy companies, the big manufacturers. Cascade that capability and that investment down in the local community, whether it's the smaller bank that you may trade with or whatever. There are ways that we can do this. We were talking kind of like the AmeriCorps for cyber. There are really ways that we can take these centers of excellence in cybersecurity that reside in the private sector and push it into some of the more deserving
And if you do
areas.
look at the establishment of the Land Grant Institute, it does line up frighteningly similar. We are the new ag cyber in some sense. Ag still matters, but it really does line up in all of those issues. We've got time for the quickest question if someone has one. Quick question right there and a quick answer.
Yeah, that's impossible.
You're going to miss
You
your
know
flight, dude.
We're all right.
All right, good. So we've got a couple minutes.
Hi, my name is John Armstrong. I'm actually with the private sector. I actually build payment processing systems, so I'm under the whole PCI umbrella.
Yep.
My question actually dovetails really neatly off of the conversation you just have, which is, how do I get that information research from y'all so I can integrate it into my own security posture of my company? I'm the director of IT and security, so I manage all of this for the entire environment, and I run a cloud native environment.
Yeah.
And so part of what I'm trying to do is it's so bleeding edge what we're doing that we're cutting our fingers everywhere as we're trying to integrate that security posture. How do we do everything in the cloud in a secure way? As you said, security by design, security by deployment. How then do I get all this information from y'all? Because y'all are obviously thinking about these hard challenges, these hard problems. How do I then get that information? How do I go back to my desk today, get plugged into it, so that way I can start disseminating that information throughout my own company, but also then get that buy-in from the executive level and make those arguments with the executive level. When I sent an email yesterday saying we need a security operations team like today, not yesterday. Well, we really needed it 6 months ago.
So, I mean, this is another fireside chat too.
Yeah, this is a full.
So we've
that's
spent a lot of time as an agency and as a prior organization focusing on you as our audience, and increasingly what we're finding is you're a key audience, but your bosses, your boards, or whatever your leadership structure
Governance,
is,
yeah.
that's a second audience for us, so that I can prepare the battlefield. So when you come forward and say you need a security operations team, they understand the threat, they understand the investments required, and they already have that increased level of awareness, so that it makes it easier to increase investment, which leads to that increased capability. But at the very bottom of it, or the very top of it rather, us-cert.org, us-cert.gov. That's our one-stop resource for any information. But also give us feedback. What is it that you need? Again, that goes to that second principle of results-driven. Tell us where your pain points are and the gap you're finding, and that helps direct direct our capability investments.
Do you want to opine on the cloud? Because, I mean, when you think of national critical functions, beyond just national critical infrastructure sectors, when you think of PNT, nav timing.
So we didn't talk a lot today about the national critical functions, which so basically 16 sectors, we talked about that. We're trying to break things down into something that's more understandable, a risk architecture. I talked about data architectures, but talk about a risk architecture. How do we truly, from a more granular perspective, break down what it is in the economy that we care about? It's not one bank. It's the thing that the bank does. It's the functions, the services, and then start prioritizing risk across those functions. So at the end of the day, it might not be the ATM systems that we're focused on. It's wholesale payments.
SWIFT and all.
And SWIFT, right. And then start moving that across other segments and sectors of the economy. Cloud plays into that. I think we're still in the early days, we are in the early days of utilization of cloud. I think we've shifted more where you're getting a lot more user and consumer experience and outcomes that they're trying to achieve that then feeds back into the engineering side of it that is going to get the outcomes. But again, I think we're struggling, obviously, because there continues to be unsecured whatever buckets out there and other data breaches just from a configuration perspective. But I don't see us, this is one of those technologies where we're not going to walk away from the cloud. How do we make sure that it serves our security interests?
The tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant here.
Yeah.
Before I ask everyone to thank all of you for attending and especially thank Chris for taking some time, I just want to say thanks very briefly to Leslie, Claudia, Matt. Raise your hands. These guys did a lot of work. This is the first go-around we're doing here. We've got amazing group of people we're working with in College of Engineering. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today, and please join me in thanking Chris for.
Thank you.